Well, thank you so much, Liz, for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be back here in person. This is the first presentation I've given in, I think, 18 months where I'm not wearing a button down and gym shorts and flip-flops. And special thanks to Joyce and Francis Pandolfi for hosting me tonight. Joyce is an old friend of my Auntie Susan's. They knew each other in Westchester County outside of New York, where I'm originally from. And also thanks to Liz Wood and the entire staff of the Stonington Historical Society for making this possible in these times. It is a sign of hope that that we are having in-person talks. And I also recognize, way in the distance, Phil Gerwin, who I went to high school with in Chappaqua, New York. Thank you so much for coming here. It was a surprise to see that he is now living here in Stonington. But I'd like to just start with my story about how I wrote Barons of the Sea. This is a story of how a book started off as one thing and ended up as another. I originally was going to write a biography of the great clipper shipbuilder Donald Mackay of East Boston, many of whom you've heard of, the builder of the great ships, the Flying Cloud and the Westward Ho and the Sovereign of the Seas, sort of mirroring my book on William Francis Gibbs and his construction of the SS United States. And the SS United States was an ocean liner built in the 1950s, and I decided to go back 100 years into America's past, into the 1850s and 1840s, writing about when America was truly supreme on the world stage as a maritime power. And I started writing this book on Donald Mackay, who is also an immigrant success story. He came from Nova Scotia and started his life, a new life here in America as a shipbuilder. And then I unfortunately found out from a descendant of his that his personal papers were destroyed in a flood in the 1920s. So I had a big egg on my face, and I was about to write my publisher saying, how am I supposed to reverse engineer this book? And then in 2014, I was watching the PBS documentary on the Roosevelt family, which was a wonderful TV piece of documentary work by Ken Burns. And talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt's maternal family, they began talking about his maternal grandfather, Warren Delano II, a native of Fairhaven, Massachusetts, which is right across the river from New Bedford. And part of this extraordinary coastline from Connecticut all the way up to Rhode Island and New Bedford that produced so many key characters from the clipper ship era and the whaling era. And they mentioned Warren Delano II, who had made himself a millionaire in the China trade, and was the father of probably the original American tiger mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. And those of you that know anything about her, she unfortunately gave her poor daughter-in-law, Eleanor, a very hard time. She had very exacting standards, many of which she inherited from her father. And Sarah Delano Roosevelt would like to say about her only child, Franklin, oh, Franklin, he's not a Roosevelt at all. He's all me. He's all Delano. So what did that mean, all Delano? And that's when I began researching more into Warren Delano II. It turned out he was one of the great forces behind the construction of the clipper ships. He was the scion of a New Bedford whaling family. He was owner or part owner of several great clipper ships. And he was one of these many Yankee men who moved to New York City as a teenager to seek their fortunes. And then I sort of used the story of the Delanos as a way to tell the story of the great clipper ships. So it's family history and also story of these great American technological marvels, which for a very brief period between 1840 and 1865 ruled the waves, were the fastest commercial vessels ever built. They're the envy of the world. Great Britain was shocked that these Yankees were building ships that bested their own in the China trade. It was also a look into a time when these Yankees from Connecticut and from Rhode Island and from New Bedford and from Nantucket, before globalization was even a word, these are people who had traveled as far away as China, as Antarctica, as we know from the case of Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer, to the Mediterranean. These people knew the world well before most of America knew that there was a world beyond the continental United States and manifest destiny. They saw the future of America as a maritime global powerhouse and trading power. And here is Warren Delano II, a picture that's taken at the peak of his wealth in the mid-1850s with 2 of his 10 children, and that was very common back then. Several of whom unfortunately died. One of whom died in China, their firstborn, and he is someone who is by then the proud owner or part owner of multiple clipper ships. He has an estate on the Hudson River, a townhouse in Manhattan. He is at the top of the world at the time, and connected with many of the great New England trading families. And what could possibly go wrong? Well, eventually things do go wrong for the Delanos. They have to claw their way out of financial ruin, but that is a story for later. Now consider the story, what a clipper ship looks like. This is a clipper ship of the mid-1840s, the Sea Witch, built in 1846. And many of you, I have had people come up to me and say, oh, I saw a clipper ship the other day. I saw the Coast Guard ship Eagle come into town. That's a clipper ship. And I'm saying, well, that's not exactly a clipper ship. A clipper ship is not just any vessel with 3 masts and square sails. A clipper ship is a very specific type of vessel, a commercial vessel built for speed above capacity. And they're built between a very specific period of time, between 1840 and 1860. And they're built primarily out of wood. And this clipper ship, the Sea Witch, set the record from sailing from Hong Kong to New York City in 74 days. Now, in today's era of 14-hour flights between Hong Kong and New York, that does not sound all that great. But consider that only about 8 years before, a typical full-bottomed, very slow vessel, trading vessel, sailing between China and New York would take 6 months. So these ships really were revolutionary. These ships were what Amazon and Jeff Bezos did for global trade. These ships carried very high value freight that people were willing to pay top dollar to get to market. And the clipper ship that made it to market first with these goods. First it was tea and other Chinese luxury goods from China, and later northeastern manufactured goods from New York and Boston are sailed around Cape Horn to San Francisco during the gold rush. These ships really sped up global trade at a rate that had not been imagined before. By the way, these ships were much faster than contemporary steamship vessels. So the Sea Witch really was one of many of these clipper ships that made a small number of New England families very rich, and some famous captains, including Stonington's own Nathaniel Brown Palmer, wealthy and powerful, and also famous as well. And the definition of a clipper ship is, as I said earlier, a 3-masted vessel, all of which are square-rigged, although there have been some clipper barks that were built first and foremost for speed over capacity. And I've been asked many times, where does the term clipper ship come from? And the earliest reference I could find is the English Restoration poet John Dryden's description of a falcon as she clips down the wind. And this book follows the story of several New England families, but 2 principal characters I like to follow as sort of dynastic contrast are 2 natives of the New Bedford area. The gentleman on the left is Warren Delano II, who I mentioned earlier. The gentleman on the right is Moses Grinnell, who is from across the river in New Bedford. These 2 men both came from whaling fortunes, families that have made their money. Their fathers were either captains or whale oil merchants. And the New Bedford area at this time, in the early 1800s, was kind of like I guess you could say it's comparable to the oil industry, and the energy industry. There was a lot of money being produced in New Bedford, and there was a lot of places where these merchants were looking to put it. And the fathers of these 2 men, Captain Warren Delano I and Cornelius Grinnell, decided to, when their sons were the teenagers, they decided, okay, that's enough school. Your job is now to go to New York City and make your fortune. And these 2 men also arrived in New York just after the opening of the Erie Canal. So a lot of Yankees from this part of the world and from Nantucket decided to go to New York because that's where it seemed like there was the most opportunity was, and there was a lot of whale oil capital that needed to be invested. So it was also a dirty business, as many of you know, and a very risky business. These fathers, the fathers of these men were often away for 2 to 3 to 4 years at a time. So, and they would sometimes come back with a profit, sometimes they wouldn't. So these men's fathers were looking for more stable careers for them in the great burgeoning port of New York City, which after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1826, leapfrogged over Boston and Philadelphia to become America's largest port and the largest city. So I mean, New York was actually in third place for a very long time. It was the opening of the New York Canal that turned New York into the great emporium of the world, where grains from the Midwest were shipped down the Erie Canal and down the Hudson River out of New York City. You also had luxury goods from China coming in, and you had these merchant firms on the second and third floors of these buildings on South Street. This is where Warren Delano and Moses Grinnell went to work as teenagers to learn business. And it was a very exciting place to be. It was a betting city. It was a city full of innovation, and you had and betting as well. You had steam engines coming around for the first time, railroads. You had yacht races. You had the electric telegraph, which allowed instantaneous communication between large cities. You also had horse racing up and down Broadway. It was a very exciting place for a young boy from a small town in New England to be. But these two men took two very different paths, which would ultimately, for them, lead back into the clipper ship business. Moses Grinnell decided to start a business with his whaling money that operated transatlantic packets that operated between New York and Liverpool, basically carrying cotton and immigrants. And he was known as a sedentary merchant. He would stay behind in New York and basically be a manager. Warren Delano, on the other hand, in 1833, took a much more risky route. In his early 20s, he was given a chance by his firm to be its representative in faraway Canton, China, modern-day Guangzhou, where he would get involved in the tea trade. This is a much riskier, much more dangerous, and also more mysterious way to make a living. And there was talk among the young men of New England that if you came back from China after 10 years or so, you would come back with a competence. That was the equivalent of about $100,000, which was enough to make you independently wealthy. That doesn't sound like a whole lot today, but $100,000 in the 1830s, 1840s, that would place you well within the 1% of American society, trading in tea and other Chinese goods. So Warren Delano set sail from New York with a lot of expectations on his shoulders to Canton, China, to this small area, maybe around 5 or 6 city blocks, where the foreign merchants were allowed to live. This was the only place on mainland China where foreigners were allowed to live, aside from the island of Macau, which is where the wives and children would live if they came along. The men would live in the factory district on the mainland. This was a work hard, play hard environment. You had international trading firms from London, Scotland, New England. You had Sephardic Jews. You had this melting pot of various firms where people would come together to trade in Chinese goods. Now, the Chinese government saw the presence of the so-called fan kuei, the foreign devils, as a kind of major inconvenience, but they made some money for the kingdom in customs duties, but they were not really welcome here. So the foreigners were confined to this small area. Warren Delano's ambition was to become a partner in one of the major Chinese trading firms, and that one was Russell and Company, which has its roots in Middletown, Connecticut. I'll get to Russell and Company a little bit later. But this is a sort of vessel that tea chests and other Chinese goods, silks or whatnot, were shipped home in before the age of the clipper ship. This is known as a East Indiaman. The British versions of these ships were converted fourth-rate warships. They were slow. They would maybe only go around 8 knots or so, and the British captains would often take in sail at night because, what's the rush? Because the British version of this trade was a government-sanctioned monopoly. The American traders had no such government interference whatsoever. This was pure laissez-faire capitalism. The only interest the U.S. government had in this business was that they collected their customs duties, because that was a major source of government revenue for the federal government for the income tax of 1913. So the federal government really didn't care that much in managing the trade. They just wanted the customs duties. So American captains were known to sail their ships a little bit faster, a little bit more recklessly than the British ships. But American shipbuilders here in Connecticut and also in New York began tinkering with this basic design that they inherited from the English traders, the so-called codfish head mackerel tail. Basically, you had a blunt bow and a sharp stern and a flat bottom. This was derived from 17th century British naval design, more basis in superstition rather than actual science, basically shaped like a fish, saying, well, if you shape it like a fish, it'll sailed fast. That was actually totally incorrect. But the Americans were tinkering with this. And a lot of the designs to make these sorts of ships faster came right out of here, off the Connecticut shoreline, because during the War of 1812, as you all know, there were privateer schooners that were designed to outrun the British ships, and these sleek designs began working their way into the American China traders. Now, if you were Warren Delano II, you wanted to know this guy. This was the Chinese merchant Wu Ping Chen, who was known in the American and British pidgin term as Hao Kwa. He was the man, the head of the dozen or so Chinese traders who was allowed to do business with the foreign devils, as they were known. And he was arguably the richest non-sovereign in the world, worth about $26 million in the 1830s at his peak, because he controlled some of those valuable tea plantations in China. Now, tea is something we take for granted today. You can go into Whole Foods or at any time of the year and go get it, but during this era, tea would only arrive once a year with the arrival of the first spring pickings from China. So the first tea to get to market sold at the highest price, and various varieties had vast differences in price. So Hao controlled, I guess you can say, I don't know, the Harney and Sons or whatever the fanciest tea company you can imagine. He controlled this, and $26 million, that's a lot of money today, but back then you're talking Jeff Bezos billions. So he actually took a fondness to these American traders who were coming over, because he felt, unlike the British, they weren't arrogant, they were eager to learn, and he only took in as his so-called adopted sons partners of the American firm of Russell and Company, which was founded by a gentleman named Samuel Russell from Middletown, Connecticut. And Warren Delano eventually merged his smaller firm with Russell and Company, which set him well on the way to be earning his competence and becoming one of Hao Kwa's adopted sons, along with two brothers from Boston, John Murray Forbes and Robert Bennett Forbes. So this was a very exclusive little club here of Americans who had come over as teenagers. Many of them were related to each other. Warren Delano was not related to the Forbeses. The Forbeses would eventually take their China trade money, purloin it into the ownership of clipper ships. That money would later be rolled over into the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and then that money would be eventually rolled over into a company that became known as AT&T. So you're talking dynastic wealth here on the Forbeses. The Forbeses also now currently own Naushan Island, which is not too far away from here. So Warren Delano got to be part of this group of small Yankee capitalists trading in tea and something else. So this was the world that these young men from New England saw. This was Hao Kwa's palace on Honam Island, and you're like, whoa, I'm being waited on by these servants, I'm being served, this is incredible. I never would have imagined I would be in this sort of setting. Now, a lot of these men decided, oh, one day when I come back and earn my competence, I will build something just like this. And many of them did on the banks of the Hudson River and in Newport, Rhode Island, on the North Shore of Boston. So where do you think a lot of those big mansions come from? A lot of them got their inspiration from Hao Kwa's palace. But the dark side of the story is that the money that was used to pay for Hao Kwa's tea and to export this tea home to America came from came from opium. America did not produce a whole lot of things that the Chinese wanted to buy, aside from maybe ginseng from Vermont. That was about it. There was a big trade deficit. And eventually the Americans decided to do something that the British have been doing since the 1760s, smuggling opium into China from India and from Turkey. And that was used to make up the difference. And Warren Delano II saw this happening, and he basically said, this is a perfectly fair, legitimate, and honorable business. I don't see what the problem with opium dealing is. And Robert Bennett Forbes, his fellow partner, would say, I don't see any difference between dealing opium and selling strong spirits and strong whiskey. Now, I'm sure they knew of the devastation this is wreaking on the Chinese population. But it was just too convenient. The money was too equal. That's what allowed these men to earn money so quickly and come home in 5 to 10 years. So the Chinese government had banned the sale of opium in the country in 1800, but this was the secret weapon that allowed opium to be smuggled into China. This was the Baltimore opium clipper, based also on designs of the privateers that were built in the Chesapeake Bay and also on the coast of Connecticut. These were vessels that were really built for speed and not capacity at all. And these ships would sail from India or Turkey, stop off the Chinese border or off the Chinese ports that were not open to foreign trade, and the opium would be smuggled ashore for a bribe for the customs official would go on the boat and say, you know, you're not supposed to be here. Please continue on to Canton. And the Yankee captain would say, oh, I'm really sorry, we're running short of food and water, blah, blah, blah. That was the code. The opium would be rowed ashore. The silver would change hands. That's where the money came from to buy the tea. So how far the merchant said, oh, I don't know anything about this. That's not quite true. This was becoming a real public health problem. And then in 1839, the Chinese government really cracks down and says, no more of this stuff is allowed in. We're going to besiege the foreigners' colony in Canton. We're going to seize 20,000 chests of this drug. And the other result of this was that the Royal Navy says, thou shalt not steal the Queen's opium, and sails into Canton Harbor and shells the Chinese fleet into smithereens. And as a result of the First Opium War, the Chinese government is forced to cede this island of Hong Kong, which they thought was a fairly useless bit of rock. But it ends up being a very valuable opium trading post for the British Empire. And 5 more Chinese ports are open to foreign trade. And Warren Dell II, by the way, is there at the shelling of Canton Harbor by the Royal Navy. And he writes home basically saying, well, it's a shame that this has had to happen, but the Chinese have acted in such an arrogant way that they deserve this, which is pretty chilling. But he also said, by the way, since we know what's going to happen now that the Chinese have been defeated, this is a perfect opportunity for us to invest in larger vessels to carry more tea home to America. And this was one of the first of the true clippers. This is the Anne McKim of 1833. Basically a opium clipper rigged as a 3-masted sailing ship. And this ship had a very sharp bow, a sharp stern, very limited cargo capacity. So she wasn't exactly a moneymaker, but she was the fastest ship in the China trade at the time. And she captured the eye of Warren Delano and these Yankee traders who were there in China. And then when the Opium War ended, the First Opium War, they decided, why don't we try to build larger versions of these vessels to take advantage of this increased market? And this is the result. As you can see, this clipper ship of the Young America, this is a half-hull model. Sharp bow, sharp stern, and big, able to carry more chests of tea, but able to sail fast, and also a much higher rig. What makes, well, you can't see it in this half model, but these new clipper ships that started coming out, financed by men like Warren Delano, they had much more sail area than earlier ships because tea is a very high-priced good. You need lots of men, 60 or so men to man all that sail. That makes it worthwhile to have ships that are narrower, finer line, and can carry more sail. Now, there are a number of naval theorists and designers who are tinkering with this concept in Connecticut and in New York City. One of the most famous of whom was John Willis Griffiths, who worked at a shipyard on the East River, and this is his most famous clipper ship, the Sea Witch of 1846, which set that record between Hong Kong and New York City in 74 days. By the way, that record was not beaten under sail until the yachtsman Rick DeMoule in 2003 beat it in a modern sailing yacht. And talking to him at the Larchmont Yacht Club, he basically said, this was extraordinarily hard work, and these men did it without satellite navigation, without any modern aids, and I was in a carbon fiber yacht under no pressure to get there with a valuable cargo. But the Sea Witch was a remarkable vessel and made a tremendous amount of money for her owners, the firm of Howland and Aspinwall. And this ship had a sharp V bottom, a sharp bow, and a sharp stern, so Griffith said you have to sacrifice cargo capacity drastically to get speeds of anywhere from 15 to 18 knots, which was a pretty incredible turn of speed for a sailing vessel. Now, our hometown hero, Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer, who was had previously captained not just sealing vessels, but also cotton packets between New Orleans and New York City, he looked at Griffith's design and said, wait a minute, yeah, I get the sharp bow and the sharp stern, but you lose too much money and lose too much stability when you have a V-shaped bottom. He had sailed these cotton packets between New Orleans and New York City. And he noticed that these ships had very flat bottoms, but they actually were very stable, and if you had a sharper bow and a sharper stern, they'd actually be just as fast. So he worked with his boss, the clipper ship owner Abiel Abbott Lowe of New York City, and Brooklyn, by the way. He was a business partner of Warren Delano II. Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer said, "I'll build you a new type of vessel, a new type of clipper ship that has the best of Griffith's design, but will be able to carry more cargo because it will have a flat bottom and therefore make you more money." Abiel Abbott Lowe had also spent time in China with Warren Delano II. They were very close friends. And Nathaniel Brown Palmer, starting in the late 1840s, began turning out his own new designs, which proved to be tremendously successful, much more successful than Griffith's design. And Nathaniel Brown Palmer was a self-taught naval architect, but he learned it not through theory or reading books, but through actually being a captain and observing how different types of vessels operated in different sorts of conditions. And Abiel Abbott Lowe loved him so much that he appointed him, promoted him from captain to being basically chief superintendent of all ship design. He also had a bit of a problem in that he had a wayward younger brother named Charles Porter Lowe, the youngest of the very large Lowe family of Brooklyn. Charles Porter Lowe did not want to go to Canton and become a proper merchant like his brothers. He wanted to run away to sea and be a sailor. And Abiel Abbott Lowe said, "Kid brother, that's not a proper profession for someone of a family of our standing right now. You should go to Canton and be a merchant." He actually ran away to sea at age 13 on one of his brother's ships and was caught in the storage locker just before the vessel left New York City. And it was when that happened, finally, Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer said, "Boss, I will take your troublesome youngest brother in hand and teach him how to be a proper captain." And Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer, in addition to his famous exploits as an explorer, he was also a wonderful mentor of many young men who ended up becoming clipper ship captains. And Charles Porter Lowe ended up commanding a clipper ship of the Lowe firm named after Nathaniel Brown Palmer, the N.B. Palmer, which was one of the longest lived clippers. She sailed in the China trade from the 1850s until the 1870s, so very unusual for a clipper ship to live that long. But Charles Porter Lowe wrote a wonderful set of memoirs, one of the few sets of memoirs left by a clipper ship captain that describes many humorous stories about his life as a captain, and also writes glowingly of Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer as a father figure. And if that name Lowe looks familiar, those of you that are familiar with Columbia University, the main library, Lowe Library, built with clipper ship money. That was that campus that was built on Morningside Heights, that was paid for by the Lowe family to move from Midtown. So another major impact of this family. Now this was the clipper ship Oriental, designed by N.B. Palmer, that caused the British to sit up and take notice, because in 1850 she made the first voyage from Hong Kong to London. She was able to carry a cargo of tea in 97 days, beating the fastest British ship by weeks. And when the Oriental arrived in London, the reaction of the British press was, "How dare these Yankees? How dare they? We rule the waves. How could they do something like this? We must run a fast race with our upstart rivals." And the British began building knockoff clippers, as I like to call them, that never quite exceed the speed of these Yankee vessels. A group of Boston and New York merchants, including Warren Delano II, pool a bunch of money together and basically say, "Look, we're willing to run a regatta-style race between Hong Kong and London, an American ship and a London ship with a purse of 10,000 pounds. May the best ship win." The British never bid. The British never dared compete. So this ship really calls the world to notice. But
Where was she built?
The Oriental. She was built in New York City.
New York.
What really caused clipper ships to grow even bigger and even faster was when gold was discovered in California in 1848. And this is what turned the clipper ship business from a New York or Boston to China trading venture into a round-the-world venture, when ships would sail from New York all the way around Cape Horn, southern tip of South America, 10,000 miles to San Francisco, arguably the most dangerous sea route on the face of the earth. And they would sail from San Francisco to China, and then San Francisco home around to New York. Now, the discovery of gold in California, tens of thousands of people, mostly men, dropped everything they were doing on the East Coast and found whatever way they can get to San Francisco. They would go across by a wagon. They would take steamships to the Isthmus of Panama, slog through the jungle, get another steamship to San Francisco. These were male steamers would do this. Or they would get on a clipper ship and sail to Cape Horn. Now, the old saying about a gold rush is you don't make money digging for gold. You make money selling stuff to the guys digging for gold. So Warren Delano II recognized this opportunity first, and he deployed his China clipper, the Memnon. He took her off the China route, loaded her up with chairs, tables, booze, cheese, eggs, you name it, every sort of manufactured or agricultural good that's made in the factories and the farms of the East Coast, shipped around to the small fishing village of San Francisco, and made a tremendous profit, I think around $60,000. San Francisco during the peak boom years, this is a city where an egg sold for $1, one 1850s dollar. You're talking about a $20 egg. Boots were going for $60. Everything was inflated. So freight rates were sky high. So many other clipper ship owners, including the Lowe's and the Forbeses, took their clippers, sort of redeployed them, and would make voyages to San Francisco and then sail across the Pacific, buy tea in China, then sail home. So these ships were earning $100,000 to $200,000 per voyage. And this is what allowed the clipper ships to grow even bigger and even faster. And because of Nat Palmer's design, the flat-bottomed clipper ship became the basis for the mighty California clippers of the 1850s. These are the ships we still remember today, ships with names like Flying Cloud and Westward Ho, Sovereign of the Seas, Romance of the Seas. These ships were the largest merchant ships in the world and true works of art. Now, if you were sailing from New York to San Francisco, these ships would carry around 20 passengers or so, but this is kind of like taking the Learjet to San Francisco. It was very expensive. You would be housed in the stern, you would have good food. But if you were a crew member, there were 60 of them or so on the big California clipper. You would work 4 hours on, 4 hours off, but usually that wasn't the case when time was money. And these ships would set progressive records from New York to San Francisco. The first clipper ship was 121 days, then they made it down to 96 days. And the goal was to get it below 90 days. That was the big hope. When before, a typical sailing ship would take, 6 to 8 months. So once again, incredible. But a sailor, there was no workers' rights, there's no workers' comp, there's no way to communicate with land. I mean, not until 1900 or so could ships radio ocean, or radio to land. So once you're out there, you're truly out there. And if you're in the middle of a raging gale and you had to take in sail, and the first mate said go up there, and there's a 13-story mast going like this, you couldn't tell the first mate that goes against safety and labor regulations. You would get flogged. And you did not clip in like you would today in a modern sailing ship when you got up on the yardarm. You would hang on for dear life. And there are many men, hundreds of men, who were lost overboard or died of disease or malnutrition. So pure laissez-faire capitalism, no regulation of any type. Sailors were very poorly paid. It was all about profits. And this would later come back to haunt one clipper ship owner in particular. This shows often these clipper ships would sight each other and race each other around Cape Horn. This is what Cape Horn looks like, the very southern tip of South America. Tierra del Fuego, a land of fire. This was also known as Dead Man's Road, because so many ships were lost trying to go around Cape Horn. You would often be faced with a westerly gales blowing you back and back and back. And sailing ships, square rig ships, do not sail very well going into the wind. So if you were unlucky, you could lose precious weeks, or you could run aground or strike an iceberg. All sorts of bad things could happen to you. And even in bad weather, captains would pile on the sail because they saw it as a speed opportunity. But this, in the case of the Comet, this is what happened to her. I mean, these ships were often dismasted, and they would either have to be repaired at sea during the lull in the gale, or they'd have to put into port in Valparaiso, Chile, where they would get charged out the nose. So you ideally did not want to have to get put into port, or if you were really facing contrary winds, you'd have to sail almost down to Antarctica to find better winds. And imagine trying to navigate a clipper ship through icebergs without any sort of auxiliary power. So this was rough stuff and very dangerous work. But the man that truly perfected the clipper ship as a type and owed a lot to Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer was the great clipper ship builder Donald Mackay of Boston. And he took the best of these design techniques developed in New York City and in Connecticut and transferred them to his ships. And he was an immigrant from Nova Scotia, Canada, came here as an apprentice to New York City as a teenager. His father basically sold away his parental rights for young Donald Mackay to become a shipyard apprentice, where there he learned the art and mystery of becoming a shipbuilder. And eventually in the 1830s, he started his own yard in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and then set up shop permanently in East Boston. And he built both transatlantic packet ships, and he also built clipper ships. And I love these quotes that he would like to say about his art as a shipbuilder. He actually really became kind of the craftsman as American hero. He was a very big publicity hound, and he loved speaking to the papers. He really felt that the clipper ship builder, the shipbuilder, should be on the same footing as these great merchant princes. He said, I'm the one that actually builds these great works of art. My ships are monuments on the ocean, he would say. And he would like to say, my speech is rude and uncultivated, but my feelings, I trust, are warm and true. I never yet built a vessel that came up to my own ideal. So he was a perfectionist. He had his second wife, Mary Mackay, by the way, not only managed the books of the Mackay shipyard, but she also came up with many of these wonderful clipper ship names that we still remember today. And the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was a very close friend of his, and he dedicated the building of the ship, the famous poem, to his good friend Donald Mackay. Sail on, thou great ship of state, was in reference to his good friend Donald Mackay. Donald Mackay never moved to fashionable Beacon Hill in Boston. He always lived in more blue-collar East Boston, where his shipyard was, because he felt he was very much of the people, of the working class, but he also really felt, I could entertain senators and poets and businessmen. He attracted the admiration of many of these tycoons, but they also felt that sometimes his design ideas were more than a little outlandish and too ambitious. Here is what the Mackay shipyard looked like at its peak in the 1850s in Boston. You could have seen similar scenes along the East River in New York City. During the Boone, California years, several ships were built at the same time, built in the span of 6 to 8 months, built almost entirely out of wood. This is a very intricate art, and to become a master shipbuilder took a decade or more after graduating from being an apprentice. So these ships were built out of mostly white oak and yellow pine. Those are kind of known, those are gold standards of shipbuilding wood. And Mackay himself would go down there and keep an eye on everything. He would have no qualms or felt no sense of place or superiority. He would often pick up a mallet and get to work himself. And but his most famous ship was only the second clipper ship he ever built. And this is the clipper ship Flying Cloud, built in 1851. And this is where, remember I mentioned Moses Grinnell, who was kind of the counterpoint to Warren Delano. This is where Moses Grinnell re-enters the picture. Moses Grinnell had built a very successful business operating packet ships between New York and Liverpool and New York and London. He decided it was his time to get into the clipper ship business, into the California and China trade business. Much to the consternation of Warren Delano and his group of friends, they saw him as kind of this like interloper into their little club. Moses Grinnell heard about this new clipper ship called the Flying Cloud that was being built for a Boston merchant, and Moses Grinnell had Mackay built ships for him before, packet ships, and Moses Grinnell told the then owner of the partially finished Flying Cloud, I'll offer you $90,000 for that beautiful new ship that's not finished. So the owner, Enoch Train, took the money. Moses Grinnell bought the Flying Cloud, and Enoch Train would later say that was the worst business decision he ever made, because the Flying Cloud proved to be the iconic and probably the most profitable clipper ship of her time. In 1851, she set sail from New York to San Francisco, and she had as a captain Josiah Perkins Creasy of Marblehead, Massachusetts, who had a secret weapon he had a navigator, his wife. She was Eleanor, his navigator. She was a brilliant mathematician, and thanks to his aggressive sailing and her navigation, this ship arrived in San Francisco in 89 days, 21 hours, a record which stood under sail until 1989. And by the way, 3 years later, the Creases beat their own record in the Flying Cloud, 89 days, 8 hours. That record, pardon me, stood until 1989. And the Flying Cloud proved to be iconic, celebrated in song and paintings, and made Moses Grinnell one of New York's richest men, or helped make Moses Grinnell one of America's richest men. And by the way, the sort of China trade group they really wrote some rather mean things about Moses Grinnell and basically saying this guy did not do his time in China like the rest of us. But the Flying Cloud was one of these vessels that truly, when the Creases left the Flying Cloud in 1857, I believe, after 6 years of running her, no other captain was able to get a similar turnout of speed of this ship. She reached 18 and 19 knots during one period of going around the Pacific Ocean. But she was also run so hard and battered by the Creases that the next owners just didn't know what to do with her. And Grinnell sold her. And many of these clippers, by the way, did not last too long because they were run very hard, very fast. And within 10 years or so, they were worn out and not seen for good much else, and maybe converted into whaling ships or to coal hulks. So that's a story for later. But McKay's next masterpiece is the Sovereign of the Seas, which achieves the record speed of 22 knots going along the Pacific. And just to give you some context here, 22 knots is about 25 land miles an hour. A typical ocean-going steamship could only go about 10 knots in the 1850s. 22 knots was the service speed in 1912 of the RMS Titanic, which is a ship 4 city blocks long, powered by 50,000 horsepower steam engines. So these sailing ships beat steamships up until the early 20th century in terms of their speed. The next ship was that Don McKay built was the Great Republic. Now this was where many of the people he worked with thought he'd gone too far. In fact, the initial owner backed out of this. And McKay said, well, if you're not going to finish her, I will put my own money forward and finish her myself. The Great Republic of 1853, she registered almost 4,000 tons, was about 375 feet long. Her main yards were 110 feet in width. And they were so heavy that an auxiliary steam engine was deployed to help raise and lower them. And no one thought this ship was a good business idea. Everyone thought McKay was crazy, but McKay felt, look, I am going to build ships on the cutting edge here. Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer, by the way, took a look at the MB Palmer when she was under construction in Boston. He said, well, Daniel McKay has built a mighty fine and beautiful ship, but there's no ocean big enough to sail her. I'm not touching that. So he doesn't want to captain the ship. So she is finished in October of 1853, and then she is towed by a steam tug down to New York City, where she is to be loaded with cargo and set off on her maiden voyage, and then disaster hits. A fire starts at a nearby bakery on the day after Christmas, spreads throughout a good portion of the South Street shipping district, and then spreads to the Great Republic and burns her to the waterline. Donald McKay had only insured this vessel for $200,000. It had cost him $350,000 to build it. So he is financially devastated by this loss. But guess who's hired to fix up the Great Republic and turn her into something that could sail again? MB Palmer. MB Palmer is asked by his boss, Abiel Abbott Lowe, can you take this burnt out hulk and turn her into something? And he does. He supervises the salvage of the Great Republic and her conversion into a much smaller, significantly smaller sail area clipper ship. And the rebuilt Great Republic proves to be a very fast, very fine ship, as redesigned by N.B. Palmer. But one of the great tragedies of American history is that we'll never know what a four-masted clipper bark, almost 400 feet, how fast she could sail. I would bet she could hit 25 knots in the right conditions, but that never happened. Now, by the mid-1850s, the clipper ships began entering a precipitous decline because freight rates to California began dropping rapidly, because California by then develops its own agricultural infrastructure, its own factories, and you have businessmen such as William Fletcher Weld of Boston begin building so-called medium clippers. These are ships that have significantly less sail area, are much more full body, can carry more freight, slower. They can get to San Francisco in maybe 130 days. You know, what's the rush? Weld ends up becoming quite rich in his own right. He's the ancestor of Bill Weld, the governor of Massachusetts. But the extreme clipper ship begins to enter a precipitous decline. A lot of them are sold off to foreign owners, or sold for, or cut down. Their rigs are cut down to compete with these new vessels. But the clipper ship owners and some of the captains who are there at the right place in the right time, they make significant fortunes in the $200 to $1,000 to $1 million range in the 1850s, which is a fabulous amount of money. So they began building their dream houses on the Connecticut coast, like Captain N.B. Palmer, who was not just a captain, he was part owner of many of these ships and shared the profits of A.A. Lowe and Company. The Forbeses built their palaces along in Milton, Massachusetts. By the way, the Forbeses gave a significant amount of money to Milton Academy, the prep school, which was refounded with their generosity, and to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Harvard College. So a lot of this clipper ship money begins to find its way into educational institutions. Also, the Lowes give generously to Columbia. The Delanos built their mansion on the Hudson River, which was modeled off of Hopkins Palace in many ways. It looks like an Italianate house on the outside, but the inside, little Sarah Delano recalled dinner gong, bringing them to dinner. That was the first time that was used. That introduced that practice. Walls hung with Chinese antiques, and a portrait of Haokwa in the parlor. To have a portrait of Haokwa that was given to your dad by the great merchant was a sign that you were in the club and that he was watching over you. By then he had passed away. But that was kind of a talisman of being in this group of barons at the sea. Warren Dell II's wife was Catherine Robbins, who he married. He'd only known her for a few weeks when he returned from China after his first trip, and he was introduced to her by the Forbes family. They were cousins of theirs, and within 6 weeks they were married. And then, by the way, he says, "Oh, how'd you like to go back to China with me? I'd like to earn some more money." So she is like, I don't know, I just met this guy and now I'm going to China. This is a little scary. But she says, it is in my way of duty that I must go to China with him. And she ends up living in Macau, where she loses her first child in China, and a very traumatic event for her. But they eventually have 7 surviving children out of 10. And when they return from the second trip, they build their dream algonac. By the way, that sketch of algonac is in Warren Delano's own hand. So you can see that he's been thinking about his dream house for a long time, a refuge where he could have his family and forget about those years as a Canton bachelor, as they were known. But Warren Delano, unfortunately, in 1857, loses his fortune in the panic of that year. He had also not just invested in clipper ships, but also in coal mines and copper mines, and loses a tremendous amount of money. The only way he could rebuild his fortune as a 50-year-old was to go back to China and re-engage in the opium trade. This is a young man's game. And he leaves his family back at the Algonac estate saying, "I'll be back someday." And he just disappears for 2 years. There's intermittent correspondence. Little Sarah Delano remembers steaming the stamps that she began receiving from Dear Papa off the envelopes and keeping them in a scrapbook. And then in 1862, Warren Delano says, "Well, I've made enough money for the things are looking up, selling opium, not just this time to the Chinese, but also exporting it to the Union Army during the Civil War. How would the whole family like to come to China with me? And by the way, my buddy and I, Adriel Abbott Lowe, are going to send you to China on the clipper ship Surprise." So the whole family gets on the clipper ship Surprise, and it's a terrible 128-day voyage. It's a very bad passage for a clipper ship. There's a marvelous letter that Catherine Delano writes about being seasick all the way across and dealing with a bunch of very cranky children in diapers on a sailing ship. And some of the earliest memories of Sarah Delano were the sea shanties that the sailors sang, and she would later sing them to her own family. And the family is reunited in in Hong Kong, but the kids never really find out what Dear Papa is actually doing, what business he is actually engaged in. They just know that within a few years they're able to return home and reclaim their Algonac estate, and life goes back to normal, and Warren Delano reinvests his new fortunes in new industries. Now, the era of the clipper ship is very brief, maybe from 1840 to 1865. The Civil War does a number on the Northern Merchant Marine because of Confederate commerce raiders. By the 1870s, steamships are big enough and large enough that they're able to carry enough coal or fuel to make them able to carry enough cargo to make them profitable. Before that, ocean-going steamships had only carried passengers and mail. It didn't make them much sense for them to carry cargo. But by the 1870s, steamships were big enough to carry both enough fuel to make long voyages and enough freight. You have the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, and then you have the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, which makes the clipper ship by sea route kind of less practical for bulk freight to go between the coasts. And as I said earlier, the Civil War, many British-built Confederate commerce raiders burn and sink several clipper ships, and also they mostly went after whaling ships, but a few clipper ships were caught were captured and burned, and their cargo of tea taken aboard because the good folks in Richmond and Charleston missed their tea as well. That really drove insurance rates to go through the roof, and many of these barons of the sea decided to divest from their clipper ships and invest in things like railroads, coal mines, copper mines, New York real estate. Those that didn't get out in time lost their shirts. Nathaniel Brown Palmer was one of the lucky ones. He transitioned to other businesses aside from being sea captain. But there were some significant losers, one of whom was Donald McKay, who in 1871 goes bankrupt because he had continued building ships but never invested. He kept on reinvesting his profits in his shipyard, but by the 1870s, American shipbuilding was in deep, deep decline, and he died bankrupt in a small farm in Hamilton, Massachusetts. And he is, don't be deceived by the size of the house, by the way, because he ends up writing to several of his children, I've already given them as much as is already just and cannot leave them anything. So, but he is still one of the great heroes of American maritime history. He was a great designer, artist, visionary, and he built more record-breaking ships than any other clipper ship designer. The winners, well, Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer came out pretty well out of this, but so did his clients. Here is Warren Delano II, shown in the mid-1890s as an old grandfather at his family estate in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, surrounded by his many grandchildren. And many of them would ask, "Dear Grandpa, tell us about your time in China. Tell us about your business exploits." And he really didn't want to talk about it. And his former business partner, Robert Bennett Forbes, suggested to Warren, "Hey, we've had some interesting adventures together. Why don't we write a company history?" And Warren Delano said, "Absolutely not." And then his brother, John Murray Forbes was sure to. He told his brother, "I have to excise certain portions of your work." But Robert Bennett Forbes was really humorous, very telling set of memoirs anyway. He was a great raconteur, and his reminiscences were another great source of clipper ship and China trade material. But who is the grandson you see at the very top? That's Franklin. That's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Sarah Delano Roosevelt's only child. She is married at the age of 26 to the 55-year-old, I believe, widower James Roosevelt. And it was a bit of a shock that this older man proposed to the beautiful, rich, young Sarah Delano, and apparently many of her family wept at the wedding, saying, "How could such a beautiful woman marry an old man?" But they had one child, and then they couldn't have any more because of complications during the birth. So Sarah, and then soon after that, James Roosevelt, who was a very distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, by the way, has a heart attack and is an invalid. So Sarah focuses all of her intelligence and energy and drive that she says she inherited from her father and toughness into this young man who grows up to become the president that led us through the Great Depression and World War II. And I really think that a lot of that drive came from the Delano side. Also, the ruthlessness, because FDR was a great president, but he was also a ruthless politician who was, I like to say, a Harvard-educated aristocrat who also knew how to deal like a Canton merchant and a Tammany Hall boss. He was tough. He was very tough behind closed doors. Very much in contrast to the fireside chat, happy warrior, nothing to fear but fear itself. But in 1936, when he won a very difficult re-election campaign for a second term, his good friend and neighbor, Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, showed up at his house, his estate in Hyde Park. He asked President Roosevelt, how did you do that? Everyone said we'd lose. And FDR liked to say, as my grandfather liked to say, oh, never let your right hand know what your left hand is doing in business and in politics. So, so FDR, the Delano influence was there. And in closing, I could not have written this book, not just without the help of many archives in Boston and New York, and memoirs are left behind, but also with the help of many of the descendants of these barons of the sea. The gentlemen, members of the Delano family, are extraordinarily helpful, including letting me see a cache of previously unseen photographs that were hidden up in an attic in Milton, Massachusetts. But also the late Llewellyn Howland, Louis Howland, who was I was introduced to many years ago. When I was stuck with the book, I felt like I was really, had hit a dead end with Donald McKay's story. And Louis Howland is a Yankee book editor of the old school. He graduated from Harvard in '59 and was at Little Brown for many years, and I was put in touch with him. And Louis told me, he said, son, there's a book that be written about. It's about our families, and you're the man to write it. And throughout the whole process, he really was what I like to call my clipper ship rabbi, and I really am very grateful to him. He's since passed away, but I could not have written it without his guidance when I hit a low spot in 2015. And in closing, I'd like to take a page out of my wife's book. My wife is a physician at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and she says we always end our presentations with pictures of our children, so I'd like to end with two of mine, Isaac and Max. And by the way, in my research of these New England families, I've come across a lot of Isaacs and a lot of other Old Testament names. So along with Isaacs, there were Ezekiel's and Jabez's, and you name any Old Testament name. So thank you so much to the Stonington Historical Society.